Genealogist Patricia Donnelly thought she had seen every type of family mystery during her 30-year career, helping people trace their ancestry, but the case that arrived at her Boston office on a rain-soaked Thursday in March would shatter her understanding of how family histories could unfold across time. The elderly woman who knocked on her door carried with her a worn leather portfolio containing what she claimed was the most impossible family photograph ever taken. Eleanor Blackwood was 87 years old, sharp-minded despite her age, and visibly distressed about the discovery that had brought her to Patricia's genealogical research firm. Her grandmother had passed away the previous month, and while cleaning out the old woman's attic, Eleanor had found a collection of family photographs dating back to the early 1900s. Most of the images were exactly what one would expect from a well-documented family archive. Formal portraits, wedding pictures, and candid snapshots that chronicled the normal progression of births, marriages, and deaths across several generations. But one photograph had stopped Eleanor cold, leaving her staring at an image that seemed to violate the basic laws of chronology and family lineage. "Mrs. Donnelly," Eleanor said as she carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve, "I need you to look at this picture and tell me I'm losing my mind, because what I'm seeing in this image simply cannot be possible." The photograph was a formal family portrait, typical of the early 1900s, printed on heavy cardstock with the photographer's studio mark clearly visible in the corner. Hartwell and Sons Photography, Boston, Massachusetts, 1902. The image showed a prosperous middle-class family arranged in the conventional style of the era, with the father standing behind a seated mother who held an infant, while two older children stood beside their parents. Patricia examined the photograph with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades analyzing historical family images. The clothing, photographic techniques, and studio props were all consistent with 1902 photography. The formal poses, serious expressions, and long exposure requirements of early cameras had created the slightly stiff appearance that characterized portraits from that period. Nothing about the technical aspects of the image suggested any unusual circumstances, but as Eleanor began explaining her family's genealogy, Patricia realized why the elderly woman was so disturbed by what appeared to be an ordinary vintage photograph. The family in the portrait were Eleanor's great-grandparents, Thomas and Catherine Blackwood, along with their children. Patricia could verify this through the extensive family records that Eleanor had brought with her, including birth certificates, marriage documents, and detailed family trees that had been maintained across multiple generations. According to these records, Thomas and Catherine Blackwood had indeed lived in Boston in 1902, and they had indeed posed for a family portrait at Hartwell and Sons Photography Studio that year. The two older children in the photograph were Robert, age 8, and Mary, age 6, both of whom were documented as having been born in the 1890s. But the infant in Catherine Blackwood's arms, according to Eleanor's careful research, was a child named James Blackwood, who had not been born until 1923, 21 years after the photograph was taken. Patricia studied the family records more carefully, double-checking birth dates and family lineage, to ensure there hadn't been some simple clerical error or confusion between family members with similar names. But Eleanor's documentation was meticulous and comprehensive, backed up by official birth certificates, baptismal records, and census data that left no room for mistakes about chronology. James Blackwood had definitely been born on March 15, 1923, to parents William and Margaret Blackwood. William was the son of Robert Blackwood, one of the older children visible in the 1902 photograph. This meant that James was actually the grandson of Thomas and Catherine Blackwood, not their son, and he had been born an entire generation after the portrait was supposedly taken. Yet there he was in the 1902 photograph, an infant in his great-grandmother's arms, captured by a camera 21 years before his documented birth. "Mrs. Blackwood," Patricia said carefully, "have you considered the possibility that there might be some confusion about which child is shown in the photograph? Perhaps Thomas and Catherine had another son who was born around 1902 but died young, and the family records simply don't reflect his existence." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I thought of that possibility immediately, and I've spent weeks researching every possible explanation. I've checked hospital records, death certificates, cemetery registrations, and even contacted distant relatives who might have additional family information. There is absolutely no evidence that Thomas and Catherine Blackwood had any children other than Robert and Mary during the early 1900s. She pulled out additional documentation to support her research. More troubling still, I have multiple photographs of James Blackwood taken throughout his life, from infancy through adulthood. The facial features, the distinctive birthmark on his left hand, even the unusual shape of his ears all match perfectly with the infant in the 1902 portrait. Patricia examined the comparison photographs that Eleanor had arranged chronologically. The resemblance was indeed unmistakable. The infant in the 1902 portrait shared identical physical characteristics with James Blackwood, as documented throughout his well-recorded life from 1923 onward. The birthmark Eleanor had mentioned was clearly visible in both the historical portrait and the later photographs of James as a child and adult. What made the situation even more perplexing was that James Blackwood had lived a completely normal and well-documented life after his birth in 1923. He had grown up in Boston, attended local schools, served in World War II, married, raised children of his own, and died peacefully in 1987 at the age of 64. His entire life was thoroughly documented through school records, military service files, employment history, and family photographs that showed his progression from infancy to old age in the expected chronological order. "Eleanor," Patricia said slowly, trying to process the implications of what she was examining, "what did James himself say about this photograph? Did he ever see it or comment on the apparent impossibility of his presence in an image taken before his birth?" According to Eleanor, James Blackwood had indeed been aware of the photograph, though the family had never understood its significance during his lifetime. James had often remarked that he felt strangely familiar with his great-grandparents' house, despite the fact that both Thomas and Catherine had died before he was born. He claimed to have vivid memories of playing in rooms that had been remodeled decades before his birth, and he could describe family heirlooms that had been sold or lost years before he came into the world. The family had always attributed James's apparent memories to stories passed down through oral tradition, assuming that his parents and grandparents had described the old house and family possessions so vividly that James had developed false memories based on their descriptions. But the existence of the 1902 photograph suggested that James's connection to his great-grandparents might have been more literal than anyone had imagined. Patricia spent the next several days researching the technical aspects of early photography, consulting with experts in historical image analysis to determine whether the 1902 portrait could have been manipulated or altered in some way. The techniques for combining multiple images or altering photographs had existed in rudimentary forms during the early 1900s, but such manipulations were extremely difficult to execute and usually resulted in obvious visual inconsistencies that trained observers could detect. Dr. Michael Harrison, a photography historian at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, agreed to examine the portrait using modern digital analysis techniques. His assessment was unambiguous. The photograph showed no signs of manipulation, double exposure, or composite imagery. According to his analysis, the image was a single, unaltered exposure taken with equipment and techniques consistent with 1902 photography standards. The paper stock, chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, and even the specific type of mounting cardboard all matched materials that were standard for portrait studios operating in Boston during 1902. Dr. Harrison's conclusion was that the photograph was an authentic period image that had not been modified or altered in any way since it was originally taken. This authentication only deepened the mystery surrounding James Blackwood's presence in the portrait. If the photograph was genuine and unmanipulated, how could it show an infant who wouldn't be born for another 21 years? Patricia decided to expand her research beyond the Blackwood family records, investigating the history of Hartwell & Sons photography studio to see if their business records might provide additional context for the mysterious portrait. The studio had operated in Boston from 1895 to 1932, specializing in formal family portraits for middle-class and wealthy clientele. The business records preserved in the Boston Public Library's archives included detailed appointment books that documented every portrait session conducted by the studio. Patricia found the entry for the Blackwood family session, scheduled for October 15, 1902, with notes indicating that the family had requested a formal portrait to commemorate what they described as a special family gathering. But the studio records also contained something unexpected, a second entry for the Blackwood family, dated October 15, 1923, exactly 21 years later. This second appointment noted that the family had specifically requested to recreate a previous portrait, with instructions to use identical poses and studio arrangements. Patricia realized that this second session might hold the key to understanding the chronological impossibility of the original photograph. If the Blackwood family had recreated their 1902 portrait in 1923, there might be some connection between the two sessions that could explain James's presence in the earlier image. Unfortunately, the 1923 portrait had not survived in Eleanor's family collection, and the studio's own copies had been lost when their archive was damaged in a fire during the 1940s. But Patricia's research had revealed an additional layer of mystery. Why would a family choose to recreate a 21-year-old portrait with such specific precision that they requested identical poses and studio arrangements? Eleanor provided part of the answer when she consulted additional family documents that had been stored separately from the photograph collection. According to a diary kept by Margaret Blackwood, James's mother, the 1923 portrait session had been arranged at James's own insistence. Despite being an infant, James had apparently become extremely agitated whenever he was brought near the 1902 portrait, reaching toward it and crying until he was allowed to touch the glass surface. Margaret's diary entries describe James's behavior around the old photograph as unnaturally intense for such a young child. She wrote that James seemed to recognize the people in the portrait and became distressed when it was removed from his sight. The family had initially attributed this behavior to typical infant fascination with visual stimuli, but James's reactions had become so pronounced that they consulted their family doctor about possible medical explanations. The physician had found nothing physically wrong with James, but had suggested that some children possessed unusually strong connections to family history and ancestral memories. This pseudo-scientific explanation had been accepted by the family as a reasonable account for James's behavior, though Margaret's diary suggested that she remained troubled by the intensity of her son's reactions to the vintage photograph. The recreation session in 1923 had been intended to create a new family portrait that would satisfy James's apparent obsession with the old image while providing the family with a contemporary photograph that included their newest member. According to Margaret's diary, the photographer had been instructed to position James in exactly the same location where the mysterious infant had appeared in the 1902 portrait. Patricia shared these discoveries with Dr. Harrison, who agreed to expand his analysis to include the historical and genealogical evidence that Eleanor had provided. Dr. Harrison's background in both photography and art history gave him a unique perspective on cases where visual evidence conflicted with documented historical facts. After reviewing all of the available evidence, Dr. Harrison offered a theory that was both scientifically grounded and deeply unsettling. He suggested that the 1902 photograph might represent what he called a temporal echo, a phenomenon where extremely strong emotional or spiritual connections could somehow influence photographic emulsion to capture images from different time periods. According to Dr. Harrison's research, early photographic chemicals had been known to produce unexpected results under certain atmospheric and emotional conditions. The silver halide crystals used in early photographic emulsion were extraordinarily sensitive to various forms of energy, including electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and what some researchers had classified as psychic or spiritual influences. Dr. Harrison theorized that if James Blackwood had possessed an unusually strong connection to his great-grandparents, that connection might have somehow influenced the photographic process during the 1902 session, causing his image to appear in the portrait decades before his physical birth. The recreation session in 1923 might have been an unconscious attempt by the family to resolve this temporal anomaly by creating a photograph that matched James's actual chronological existence. While Dr. Harrison acknowledged that his theory bordered on the supernatural, he pointed out that early photography had often produced results that seemed to defy conventional explanations. The history of photography was filled with documented cases of images that showed deceased relatives, future events, or other phenomena that challenged rational understanding of how cameras and photographic chemicals operated. Patricia found Dr. Harrison's theory fascinating, but wanted additional evidence before accepting such an extraordinary explanation for the Blackwood portrait. She decided to research other documented cases of chronological anomalies in early photography, hoping to find similar examples that might support or refute the temporal echo hypothesis. Her research led her to the archives of the International Society for Paranormal Photography, an organization founded in the 1920s to investigate unusual photographic phenomena. The Society's records contain dozens of cases similar to the Blackwood portrait. Family photographs that showed individuals who had died before the images were taken, wedding pictures that included guests who wouldn't be born for years, and portrait sessions that had apparently captured people from different time periods within the same frame. One particularly relevant case involved the Morrison family of Chicago, whose 1898 family portrait had included a young woman who didn't marry into the family until 1905. Another case documented a school photograph from 1889 that showed a child who wasn't enrolled in the school until 1903. In each case, the individuals in question had no memory of posing for the photographs, but the images were authenticated as genuine and unmanipulated. The International Society's researchers had developed a classification system for these temporal anomalies, identifying patterns that seemed to correlate with strong emotional connections, significant family events, and periods of psychological stress or transition. They theorized that certain individuals possessed what they called chronological sensitivity, an ability to influence photographic processes across time through intense emotional or spiritual connections. Patricia shared these findings with Eleanor, who responded with a mixture of relief and continued confusion. While the historical precedents suggested that the Blackwood portrait wasn't entirely unique, they didn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how such phenomena could occur, or why certain families seemed more susceptible to chronological anomalies than others. Eleanor revealed another detail that she had initially hesitated to mention. James Blackwood had not been the only family member to display unusual behavior around the 1902 portrait. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, James had insisted that he could hear voices coming from the photograph, particularly during quiet moments when he was alone in the room with the image. According to family stories that Eleanor had gathered from older relatives, James claimed that his great-grandparents Thomas and Catherine spoke to him through the photograph, sharing memories and family information that he couldn't have learned through normal means. James's parents had initially dismissed these claims as typical childhood imagination, but they became concerned when James began accurately describing family events and people that had occurred or lived before his birth. The most unsettling example involved James's detailed knowledge of a family tragedy that had been deliberately hidden from younger generations. When James was 7 years old, he had accurately described the circumstances surrounding the death of his great-aunt Sarah, who had died in a house fire in 1905. The family had never discussed this tragedy in James's presence, and the official records had been sealed to protect the privacy of surviving relatives. Yet James had provided specific details about Sarah's death, including her final words and the location where her body had been found, information that was confirmed when the family finally consulted the official investigation records. James claimed that Thomas and Catherine had told him about Sarah's death through their communications via the 1902 portrait. These revelations prompted Patricia to consider whether the Blackwood family might be dealing with something more complex than a simple photographic anomaly. If James had indeed been receiving information from deceased relatives through the portrait, the temporal displacement of his image might be part of a larger pattern of supernatural communication that spanned multiple generations. Eleanor decided to consult with Dr. Amanda Sterling, a parapsychologist at Harvard University, who specialized in cases involving apparent communication between living individuals and deceased family members. Dr. Sterling had spent her career investigating claims of paranormal activity that seemed to center around family photographs, inherited objects, and ancestral homes. According to Dr. Sterling's research, family photographs often served as focal points for what she called generational echoes, instances where strong emotional bonds between family members created connections that persisted beyond death. These echoes could manifest in various ways, including apparent communication from deceased relatives, prophetic dreams about family events, and in rare cases, temporal anomalies that allowed past and future family members to interact across chronological boundaries. Dr. Sterling examined the Blackwood portrait and family documentation, paying particular attention to the psychological and emotional factors that might have contributed to the temporal anomaly. Her analysis suggested that the unusual strength of family bonds within the Blackwood lineage, combined with traumatic events like Sarah's death, had created what she termed a chronological instability that allowed family members to influence each other across time. The 1902 portrait, according to Dr. Sterling's theory, had served as an anchor point for these temporal interactions, capturing not just the physical appearance of family members present during the photography session, but also the spiritual or psychic presence of family members from other time periods who possessed strong emotional connections to the individuals being photographed. James Blackwood's appearance in the 1902 portrait might represent his future self reaching back through time to establish contact with his great-grandparents, motivated by the powerful family bonds that would define his entire life. The recreation session in 1923 had then allowed James's physical existence to align with his temporal echo, creating a closed loop that satisfied the chronological requirements for his presence in both photographs. Dr. Sterling's explanation was sophisticated and well-researched, but Patricia remained skeptical about accepting supernatural theories without exhausting all possible conventional explanations. She decided to conduct one final investigation, focusing on the technical aspects of the portrait that might have been overlooked during previous analyses. Working with forensic photography experts from the Massachusetts State Police, Patricia arranged for the most detailed technical examination possible of the 1902 portrait. Using advanced digital enhancement techniques, chemical analysis of the photographic materials, and comparison with other authenticated photographs from the same studio and time period, the forensic team hoped to identify any evidence of manipulation or alteration that previous examinations might have missed. The forensic analysis took several weeks and involved techniques that had not been available to earlier researchers. High-resolution scanning revealed individual silver halide crystals in the photographic emulsion, allowing investigators to track the exact process by which the image had been formed. Chemical analysis identified the specific compounds used in the photographic development, confirming that they matched materials standard for 1902 photography. Most importantly, the forensic team examined the areas of the photograph where James appeared, looking for any signs that his image had been added after the original development process. Their analysis was definitive. James's image had been formed during the original exposure, using the same photographic process and materials as the rest of the portrait. There was no evidence of any post-development manipulation or alteration. The forensic results eliminated the possibility that James's image had been added to the photograph through any known technical means available in 1902 or afterward. The portrait was authentic and unmanipulated, which meant that James Blackwood had somehow appeared in a photograph taken 21 years before his documented birth. Patricia compiled all of her research into a comprehensive report that documented every aspect of the Blackwood portrait mystery. Her findings included genealogical verification of family relationships, technical authentication of the photograph, historical context from studio records, psychological analysis of family dynamics, and comparison with similar documented cases of chronological anomalies in early photography. The report concluded that the Blackwood portrait represented a genuine temporal anomaly that could not be explained through conventional understanding of photography, genealogy, or family history. While Patricia couldn't endorse any specific supernatural theory about how James's image had appeared in the 1902 photograph, she was forced to acknowledge that the evidence pointed toward phenomena that exceeded current scientific knowledge. Eleanor Blackwood received Patricia's report with a mixture of satisfaction and continued bewilderment. While the professional validation of her discoveries provided some comfort, she was left with fundamental questions about the nature of family connections and the possibility that love and emotional bonds might be powerful enough to transcend the normal limitations of time and space. The Blackwood portrait joined a small but growing collection of authenticated temporal anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of how family relationships could manifest across generations. Patricia added the case to her files of unexplained genealogical mysteries, knowing that it would likely remain unsolved, despite the extensive research that had been conducted. But the investigation had revealed something profound about the power of family connections to create seemingly impossible circumstances. Whether through supernatural intervention, temporal echoes, or forces that science had not yet learned to measure, the Blackwood family had experienced something that suggested human relationships might possess capabilities that extended far beyond the physical world. James Blackwood had lived his entire life knowing that he appeared in a family portrait taken before his birth, but he had never found a satisfactory explanation for this temporal displacement. According to family members who knew him, James had remained convinced throughout his life that his great-grandparents had somehow called him into existence through the strength of their love and their desire to include future generations in their family legacy. The 1902 portrait remained in Eleanor's possession, carefully preserved as both a family treasure and a documented example of temporal anomaly. She occasionally showed it to researchers and investigators who were studying similar cases, hoping that additional examples might eventually lead to a scientific explanation for how such chronological impossibilities could occur. Meanwhile, other families began coming forward with their own examples of temporal anomalies in family photographs, suggesting that the Blackwood case might be part of a larger pattern of phenomena that had been occurring throughout the history of photography. Each new case added to the growing body of evidence that family bonds might be capable of creating connections that transcended the normal limitations of time, space, and mortality. Patricia continued her genealogical research work, but the Blackwood case had fundamentally changed her understanding of what family relationships might be capable of achieving. She began paying closer attention to unusual details in family photographs, and she developed new research protocols for investigating cases where visual evidence conflicted with documented chronological facts. The mystery of James Blackwood's presence in the 1902 family portrait remained unsolved, but it had opened new questions about the nature of family connections and the possibility that love might indeed be powerful enough to overcome any obstacle, including the boundaries between past, present, and future. Sometimes the most important family stories were not the ones that could be explained, but the ones that revealed the extraordinary depth of human connection across generations. And in the quiet moments when Eleanor looked at the 1902 portrait, she could almost hear the voices that James had claimed to detect, whispers from the past reaching forward through time to embrace future generations with love that refused to be limited by the chronological boundaries that seemed to govern ordinary existence. The photograph had become more than a family treasure. It was proof that some bonds were strong enough to reshape reality itself. But the investigation into the Blackwood portrait was far from over. 3 months after Patricia completed her initial research, she received a call that would expand the mystery in ways she had never anticipated. Dr. Harrison from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts had been contacted by curators from museums across New England, all reporting similar temporal anomalies in family photographs from their collections. The phenomenon, which Dr. Harrison had initially believed to be isolated to the Blackwood case, was apparently much more widespread than anyone had realized. Museums in Providence, Hartford, and Portland had discovered family portraits from the early 1900s that showed individuals who shouldn't have existed at the time the photographs were taken. Patricia traveled to Providence to examine the first of these additional cases, a family portrait from 1904 that had been donated to the Rhode Island Historical Society by the estate of the Morrison family. The photograph showed 3 generations of Morrisons posed in front of their family home, but according to genealogical records, one of the children in the portrait had not been born until 1919. Like the Blackwood case, the Morrison portrait had been authenticated as genuine and unmanipulated. The child in question, a boy named David Morrison, had lived a normal and well-documented life from 1919 until his death in 1983. But there he was in the 1904 portrait, clearly visible among his supposed relatives, captured by the camera 15 years before his recorded birth. What made the Morrison case even more intriguing was the discovery of detailed family letters that documented David's unusual childhood behavior around old family photographs. Like James Blackwood, David had displayed an intense fascination with vintage family images, claiming to recognize people and places from before his birth. His parents had attributed this to an overactive imagination, but the letters revealed that David had accurately described family events and deceased relatives that he couldn't have known about through normal means. Patricia spent several days in Providence working with local genealogists and historians to verify the Morrison family records and examine additional photographs from their collection. The investigation revealed a pattern similar to the Blackwood case: strong family bonds, traumatic events that had affected multiple generations, and children who displayed unusual connections to family history and ancestral memories. Most significantly, Patricia discovered that the Morrison and Blackwood families were not entirely unrelated. Through careful genealogical research, she traced connections between the two families that dated back to the mid-1800s, when ancestors from both lineages had lived in the same Massachusetts communities and attended the same churches. The Hartford case proved even more complex. The Hartwell family portrait from 1906 showed not one but 3 children who hadn't been born until decades after the photograph was taken. The temporal displacements ranged from 8 to 25 years, suggesting that the phenomenon could affect multiple family members across different time periods within the same photographic session. Dr. Catherine Wells, a historian specializing in early American photography, joined Patricia's investigation as the number of documented cases continued to grow. Dr. Wells brought expertise in both photographic techniques and social history, providing context for understanding how family photography had evolved during the early 1900s and what cultural factors might have contributed to the temporal anomalies. According to Dr. Wells's research, the period from 1900 to 1910 had been a time of significant technological and social change that had created unusual stresses within American families. The introduction of new photographic techniques, combined with changing social expectations about family documentation and ancestral preservation, had created conditions that might have amplified the emotional and spiritual connections between family members across different generations. Dr. Wells theorized that families during this period had been particularly focused on creating lasting records of their lineages, motivated by increasing mobility and urbanization that was separating extended families for the first time in American history. This intense focus on family preservation might have created psychic or spiritual conditions that allowed temporal anomalies to manifest in family photographs. The Portland case added another layer of complexity to the growing collection of temporal anomalies. The Whitmore family portrait from 1908 showed a young woman who had died in 1892, 16 years before the photograph was taken. This reversed temporal displacement suggested that the phenomenon could work in both directions, allowing deceased family members to appear in photographs taken after their deaths, as well as enabling future family members to appear in images taken before their births. Patricia worked with Dr. Wells to develop a comprehensive database of documented temporal anomalies in family photography, hoping to identify patterns that might lead to a scientific explanation for the phenomenon. Their research revealed several common factors among affected families: strong religious beliefs, significant family tragedies or losses, histories of emigration or displacement, and traditions of maintaining detailed family records and photographs. Most intriguingly, many of the affected families had ancestors who had participated in the spiritualist movement of the late 1800s, a religious and cultural phenomenon that emphasized communication with deceased family members and the continuity of spiritual connections across generations. The families who experienced temporal anomalies often had histories of seances, spiritual photography sessions, and other practices designed to maintain contact with deceased relatives. Dr. Sterling expanded her psychological analysis to include all of the documented cases, looking for personality traits and family dynamics that might predispose certain individuals to temporal displacement in photographs. Her research suggested that children who appeared in photographs before their births often displayed heightened sensitivity to emotional atmosphere, unusual empathy for family members they had never met, and sophisticated understanding of family history that exceeded their apparent access to information. These children also frequently reported dreams and visions involving deceased family members, claimed to remember events from before their births, and showed preferences for activities, foods, and places that had been significant to earlier generations of their families. Dr. Sterling theorized that some individuals possessed what she called generational consciousness, an ability to access memories and experiences from their family lineages that transcended their own individual lifetimes. As the investigation expanded to include dozens of documented cases across New England, Patricia began to suspect that the temporal anomalies represented something more significant than isolated supernatural events. The phenomenon appeared to be part of a larger pattern of family consciousness that had emerged during a specific historical period when American society was undergoing rapid change and families were struggling to maintain traditional connections across increasing geographical and cultural distances. The database that Patricia and Dr. Wells had compiled included over 60 authenticated cases of temporal anomalies in family photography, spanning the period from 1895 to 1915. Each case had been verified through genealogical research, technical analysis of the photographs, and investigation of family histories and cultural contexts. The geographical distribution of the cases was not random. They clustered in areas of New England that had experienced significant immigration, industrialization, and social upheaval during the early 1900s. Families who had been displaced from rural communities to urban centers, immigrants who had left extended families in other countries, and communities that had experienced traumatic events like natural disasters or industrial accidents showed higher incidences of temporal anomalies in their family photographs. Dr. Wells proposed that the phenomenon represented a collective response to the social and cultural disruptions of the early industrial period, when traditional family structures and community connections were being challenged by new economic and technological realities. Families that were particularly committed to maintaining their lineage connections might have unconsciously developed psychic or spiritual mechanisms for preserving family bonds across time and space. The research team decided to investigate whether similar temporal anomalies might have occurred in other countries and cultures during periods of significant social change. Working with international colleagues, they identified documented cases of chronological impossibilities in family photographs from Ireland during the potato famine, from Italy during the mass emigrations of the early 1900s, and from Eastern Europe during the political upheavals that preceded World War I. Each international case showed the same basic pattern: families under stress, strong emotional bonds between generations, and individuals who appeared in photographs taken either before their births or after their deaths. The phenomenon appeared to be universal rather than specific to American families, suggesting that temporal anomalies in photography might represent a fundamental aspect of human consciousness that manifested during periods of family or cultural crisis. Patricia's investigation had evolved from a single mysterious family portrait into a comprehensive study of temporal consciousness and the power of family bonds to transcend normal limitations of time and space. The Blackwood portrait that had started the investigation remained the most thoroughly documented case, but it was now understood as part of a much larger phenomenon that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of human consciousness and family relationships. Eleanor Blackwood had followed the expanding investigation with fascination and growing understanding of her family's place in the larger pattern of temporal anomalies. She had connected with descendants of other affected families, creating a network of individuals who shared the experience of having family members appear in photographs taken outside their normal chronological lifetimes. These families had formed an informal support group, sharing stories and experiences that helped them understand the unique heritage they had inherited. Many reported that the temporal anomalies in their family photographs had been accompanied by other unusual phenomena: prophetic dreams, apparent communication with deceased relatives, and enhanced intuitive abilities that seemed to run in family lines. The support group had also become a valuable resource for researchers studying the phenomenon, providing access to family records, oral histories, and additional photographic evidence that might not have been preserved in official archives. Through these connections, Patricia had identified several previously unknown cases of temporal anomalies and had gathered detailed information about the family dynamics and psychological factors that might contribute to the phenomenon. Dr. Harrison had expanded his technical analysis to include the latest developments in digital forensics and photographic authentication. Working with experts from the FBI's Forensic Photography Unit, he had developed new techniques for detecting even the most sophisticated forms of photographic manipulation or alteration. The results consistently confirmed that the temporal anomalies were genuine photographic phenomena rather than the result of technical manipulation or hoax. The FBI's involvement had been unofficial and limited, driven by the curiosity of individual agents rather than any formal investigation. But their participation had provided access to the most advanced photographic analysis techniques available, eliminating any remaining doubt about the authenticity of the documented temporal anomalies. Dr. Sterling had begun working with neuroscientists and consciousness researchers to investigate the biological and psychological mechanisms that might enable temporal displacement in photography. Her preliminary research suggested that the phenomenon might be related to quantum consciousness. Theories that proposed human awareness could exist partially outside normal time and space constraints. According to these theories, individuals with unusually strong family bonds or heightened emotional sensitivity might be able to project aspects of their consciousness across temporal boundaries, influencing photographic processes through quantum mechanical effects that were not yet fully understood by mainstream science. The quantum consciousness hypothesis was highly speculative and controversial, but it provided a theoretical framework that could potentially explain how temporal anomalies in photography might occur without violating fundamental physical laws. If human consciousness operated through quantum mechanical processes that existed partially outside normal space-time constraints, then strong emotional connections might create quantum entanglements that could influence physical phenomena across temporal boundaries. Patricia had initially been skeptical of such theoretical explanations, preferring to focus on documented evidence and historical research rather than speculative scientific theories. But as the database of temporal anomalies continued to grow, and as conventional explanations proved inadequate to account for the phenomenon, she had become more open to considering explanations that challenged traditional understanding of consciousness and reality. The investigation had attracted attention from researchers in multiple disciplines, including psychology, physics, history, and religious studies. Each field brought different perspectives and methodologies to understanding the temporal anomalies, creating an interdisciplinary research collaboration that was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. Religious scholars had noted connections between the temporal anomalies and traditional beliefs about ancestral spirits, reincarnation, and the continuity of soul connections across multiple lifetimes. Some proposed that the phenomenon represented evidence for religious teachings about the eternal nature of family bonds and the ability of love to transcend physical death. Physicists had begun investigating whether the temporal anomalies might be related to theoretical concepts like time loops, parallel universes, or dimensional interfaces that could allow interaction between different temporal states. While these ideas remained highly speculative, they provided scientific frameworks that could potentially account for the documented evidence without requiring supernatural explanations. Historians had placed the phenomenon in the context of other documented anomalies in historical photography, including the spirit photography movement of the late 1800s and various cases of apparent telepathic or psychic influences on photographic processes. This historical context suggested that the temporal anomalies were part of a broader category of unexplained photographic phenomena that had been occurring since the invention of photography itself. The collaboration between researchers from different disciplines had generated new insights and research directions that none of them could have developed independently. The temporal anomalies in family photography had become a focal point for investigating fundamental questions about consciousness, time, family relationships, and the nature of reality itself. Patricia had documented over 200 cases of authenticated temporal anomalies by the time she published her comprehensive research report, 3 years after Eleanor Blackwood had first brought the 1902 portrait to her attention. The report, titled Chronological Displacement in Early American Family Photography, Evidence for Temporal Consciousness and Generational Connection, had become a landmark study in the emerging field of anomalous photography research. The report documented the genealogical, technical and psychological evidence for temporal anomalies in family photographs, providing detailed case studies and statistical analysis that established the phenomenon as a legitimate subject for scientific investigation. While Patricia couldn't provide definitive explanations for how the temporal displacements occurred, her research had established beyond doubt that they were real and reproducible phenomena that deserved serious scholarly attention. Eleanor Blackwood had become something of a celebrity within the community of researchers and families affected by temporal anomalies. Her willingness to share her family's story and to support the scientific investigation had helped legitimize the study of phenomena that might otherwise have been dismissed as folklore or superstition. The 1902 Blackwood portrait had been exhibited in museums and research facilities across the country, serving as a prime example of authenticated temporal anomaly in photography. Eleanor had donated high-resolution digital copies of the portrait to research institutions while retaining possession of the original, ensuring that future researchers would have access to the evidence while preserving the photograph as a family treasure. James Blackwood's descendants had also become involved in the ongoing research, providing additional family history and genetic samples that researchers hoped might reveal biological factors that contributed to temporal sensitivity. Some of James's children and grandchildren had reported unusual experiences around family photographs, suggesting that the capacity for temporal displacement might be a heritable trait that could be passed down through family lines. The research had practical implications beyond its scientific value. Families who discovered temporal anomalies in their own photograph collections now had access to resources for understanding and coping with the psychological and emotional implications of such discoveries. Support groups and counseling services had been established to help individuals process the complex feelings that often accompanied the realization that their family relationships might transcend normal temporal boundaries. Patricia had received hundreds of letters and phone calls from people who believed they had discovered similar anomalies in their own family photographs. While many of these cases proved to be examples of mistaken identity, family resemblances, or simple chronological confusion, a significant percentage represented genuine temporal displacements that added to the growing database of documented cases. Each new case provided additional evidence for the reality of the phenomenon, while also revealing new aspects and variations that expanded understanding of how temporal anomalies could manifest in family photography. Some cases involved entire families appearing in photographs taken decades before or after their documented lifetimes, while others showed subtle temporal shifts of only a few years that might have been overlooked if not for careful genealogical research. The international expansion of the research had revealed that temporal anomalies in family photography occurred in cultures around the world, with particularly high concentrations in areas that had experienced significant migration, war, or social upheaval. This global distribution suggested that the phenomenon was a universal aspect of human consciousness rather than a cultural artifact specific to particular societies or belief systems. Dr. Wells had documented cases from Japan during the Meiji Restoration, from Russia during the Revolution of 1917, from Mexico during the revolutionary period of the early 1900s, and from various European countries during both world wars. Each cultural context provided different insights into the social and psychological factors that might trigger temporal anomalies in family photography. The cross-cultural research had also revealed interesting variations in how different societies interpreted and responded to temporal anomalies when they were discovered. Some cultures viewed such phenomena as evidence of ancestral blessings or spiritual protection, while others interpreted them as warnings or signs of family dysfunction that required ritual intervention. Western scientific culture had generally approached the phenomena with skepticism and demands for empirical verification, while many non-Western cultures readily accepted temporal anomalies as expected aspects of family spiritual life. These cultural differences had provided valuable insights into how belief systems and social expectations could influence both the occurrence and interpretation of temporal displacements in photography. Patricia's research had established temporal anomalies in family photography as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry, but it had also raised profound questions about the nature of human consciousness, family relationships, and the structure of reality itself. The phenomenon challenged basic assumptions about time, causality, and the relationship between physical and mental phenomena that formed the foundation of modern scientific understanding. The implications extended beyond academic research into practical questions about how society should respond to evidence that conventional understanding of reality might be incomplete or inaccurate. If family bonds could indeed transcend temporal boundaries, what did this mean for legal concepts of inheritance, identity, and family responsibility? How should medical and psychological professionals respond to individuals who claim to have memories or experiences that transcended their own lifetimes? These questions had no easy answers, but Patricia's research had provided a solid empirical foundation for addressing them through careful scientific investigation rather than speculation or belief. The temporal anomalies in family photography represented a phenomenon that demanded serious attention from researchers, even if the ultimate explanations might challenge fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Eleanor Blackwood continued to treasure the 1902 portrait that had started the entire investigation, but her understanding of its significance had evolved considerably. Rather than seeing it as an impossible mystery, she now viewed it as evidence of the extraordinary power of family love to create connections that transcended normal limitations of time and space. The portrait had become a symbol of hope for families dealing with loss, separation, and the challenges of maintaining connections across generations. If James Blackwood could appear in a photograph taken before his birth through the strength of his family bonds, then perhaps death and time were not the absolute barriers they appeared to be. Perhaps love truly was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of bridging any gap and reuniting families across any distance, temporal or otherwise. As Patricia concluded her years of research into temporal anomalies in family photography, she reflected on how the investigation had changed her understanding of genealogy and family history. What had begun as a profession focused on documenting factual relationships and chronological events had evolved into an exploration of the deepest mysteries of human consciousness and the enduring power of family bonds to shape reality itself. The Blackwood portrait would always hold a special place in Patricia's research, serving as the catalyst that had opened an entire new field of investigation. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that some family stories transcended the ordinary boundaries of time and space, proving that love and connection could create realities that exceeded the limitations of conventional understanding. However, the most extraordinary developments in the research were yet to come. 5 years after the initial discovery of the Blackwood portrait, Patricia received a call that would fundamentally alter everything she thought she knew about temporal anomalies in photography. Dr. Harrison had been contacted by a private collector in London who claimed to possess a photograph that showed not just temporal displacement, but active temporal interaction between individuals from different time periods within the same frame. The London photograph, dating from 1907, showed a British family posed in their garden, but according to the collector's research, the image captured a conversation between a grandmother who had died in 1895 and her granddaughter who wouldn't be born until 1920. The two figures appeared to be looking directly at each other, with body language suggesting active communication rather than the static poses typical of formal photography from that era. Patricia flew to London immediately, bringing with her a team of international experts who had joined the expanding research consortium. The photograph, owned by the Pemberton family estate, had been discovered during the restoration of a Victorian mansion that had been converted into a museum. The image had been found hidden behind a wall panel, wrapped in protective cloth, and accompanied by detailed notes describing the unusual circumstances of its creation. According to the notes written by the original photographer, the session had been intended as a standard family portrait, but during the exposure process, the photographer had observed phenomena that defied rational explanation. The grandmother, clearly visible in the developed photograph, had been deceased for 12 years at the time the picture was taken. The granddaughter, equally visible in the image, would not be born for another 13 years. Most remarkably, the photographer's notes described witnessing the two figures interact during the exposure, observing them gesture toward each other and appear to communicate despite existing in different temporal states. The photographer had initially attributed these observations to stress and overwork, but the developed photograph had confirmed that something extraordinary had occurred during the session. Dr. Harrison's technical analysis of the London photograph revealed the same characteristics that had been documented in previous cases: authentic period materials, no evidence of manipulation, and photographic techniques consistent with 1907 standards. But this image also showed something new, clear evidence of temporal interaction rather than simple temporal displacement. The body language and facial expressions of the two figures suggested that they were aware of each other's presence and were actively communicating across the temporal boundary that separated their respective time periods. This represented a significant evolution in the documented phenomena, suggesting that temporal anomalies in photography might be capable of facilitating actual communication between past and future family members. Patricia worked with the Pemberton family descendants to research the genealogical and historical context of the photograph. The investigation revealed a family history marked by strong spiritual beliefs, practices involving communication with deceased relatives, and multiple generations of individuals who had reported prophetic dreams and apparent contact with family members from other time periods. The grandmother in the photograph, Margaret Pemberton, had been known throughout her life for her apparent ability to predict future family events and to provide guidance that seemed to come from sources beyond her own knowledge and experience. Family letters described her as having unusual insight into the personalities and needs of family members she had never met, including children who wouldn't be born until after her death. The granddaughter, Elizabeth Pemberton, had been born in 1920 with immediate recognition of family members and locations that she couldn't have encountered through normal means. According to family records, Elizabeth had displayed detailed knowledge of her deceased grandmother's personality, preferences, and even specific conversations that had occurred years before Elizabeth's birth. Most significantly, Elizabeth had claimed throughout her childhood that she regularly communicated with Margaret through what she described as memory pictures that showed her scenes from family life that had occurred before her birth. These communications had provided Elizabeth with guidance and emotional support that had helped her navigate difficult periods in her life, particularly during World War II, when many of her family members had been separated by military service. The London photograph appeared to document one of these temporal communications, capturing a moment when the barriers between past and future had become permeable enough to allow direct interaction between grandmother and granddaughter across a span of 35 years. Dr. Sterling expanded her psychological analysis to include the interactive temporal anomalies, developing new theoretical frameworks for understanding how emotional and spiritual connections might enable communication across temporal boundaries. Her research suggested that certain families possessed what she termed temporal coherence, a shared consciousness that allowed family members to maintain contact and provide mutual support regardless of when they had lived or would live. This temporal coherence might explain not only the appearance of future or past family members in photographs, but also the documented cases of prophetic dreams, inherited memories, and apparent communication with deceased relatives that had been reported by many of the families affected by temporal anomalies. The research team had identified several other cases of interactive temporal anomalies in various international collections, each showing evidence of communication or mutual awareness between family members from different time periods captured within the same photographic frame. These cases were rarer than simple temporal displacement, but they provided crucial evidence for understanding the full scope of what temporal anomalies in photography might represent. A particularly remarkable case from Germany involved a 1911 family portrait that showed 4 generations of the same family, including individuals who had lived in the 1840s and others who wouldn't be born until the 1930s. The photograph appeared to document a family reunion that transcended normal temporal boundaries, with all participants appearing aware of and engaged with each other despite representing a span of nearly a century. French researchers had documented a similar case involving a 1909 wedding photograph that included deceased relatives from multiple generations, all apparently participating in the celebration despite having died years or decades before the wedding took place. The bride's journal described feeling the presence of her departed family members during the ceremony and seeing them clearly in the developed photograph despite their absence from the actual event. These international cases had established that interactive temporal anomalies were not isolated phenomena, but rather represented a consistent aspect of temporal consciousness that manifested across different cultures and historical periods. The evidence suggested that strong family bonds could create temporal bridges that allowed communication and interaction between family members regardless of the chronological distances that separated their respective lifetimes. Patricia's research had evolved into the largest international study of temporal consciousness ever undertaken, involving researchers from universities and museums across Europe, North America, and Asia. The consortium had documented over 500 cases of temporal anomalies in family photography, ranging from simple temporal displacement to complex multi-generational interactions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and consciousness. The research had also attracted attention from government agencies interested in the potential applications of temporal consciousness for intelligence gathering, historical research, and understanding of human psychological capabilities that might have strategic implications. While the researchers had maintained their focus on academic investigation, they had been careful to establish ethical guidelines for their work that protected the privacy and dignity of the families whose experiences formed the foundation of their studies. Eleanor Blackwood had become a central figure in the international research community, serving as an advocate for families affected by temporal anomalies and helping to establish support networks that could assist individuals who discovered similar phenomena in their own family histories. Her experience with the 1902 portrait had given her unique insights into the emotional and psychological challenges that such discoveries could create. Through Eleanor's advocacy work, the research consortium had developed protocols for helping families understand and cope with temporal anomalies in their photograph collections. These protocols included genealogical verification procedures, psychological counseling resources, and connections to other families who had experienced similar phenomena. The support networks had proven invaluable for individuals who might otherwise have been isolated by their experiences, or might have been dismissed by family members or professionals who lacked understanding of temporal anomaly research. The community of affected families had grown into a global network that provided both emotional support and additional research opportunities for investigating the phenomenon. Dr. Wells had documented the historical and cultural factors that seemed to correlate with higher incidences of temporal anomalies, developing predictive models that could help identify family collections that might contain undiscovered cases. Her research had revealed that families with histories of migration, religious or spiritual practices involving ancestor veneration, and strong traditions of family documentation were more likely to experience temporal anomalies in their photography. These predictive models had enabled targeted research efforts that had significantly increased the rate of discovery of new cases, while also helping families understand why they might be experiencing temporal phenomena and what cultural or psychological factors might have contributed to their occurrence. The technological advancement in digital photography analysis had also opened new possibilities for discovering temporal anomalies that might have been overlooked in previous examinations. High-resolution scanning and computer-enhanced analysis could reveal subtle details and anomalies that weren't visible to naked-eye examination, potentially identifying cases that had been misclassified or ignored in earlier research. Dr. Harrison had developed specialized software programs that could automatically scan digitized photograph collections for potential temporal anomalies, comparing facial recognition data with genealogical databases to identify individuals who appeared in photographs outside their documented lifetimes. These automated systems had discovered dozens of previously unknown cases and had accelerated the pace of research significantly. The software had also enabled the analysis of much larger photograph collections than would have been possible through manual examination, opening up new research opportunities in major archives and museum collections that contained hundreds of thousands of historical family photographs. Patricia had established a permanent research institute dedicated to the study of temporal consciousness and anomalous photography, with funding from private foundations, academic institutions, and government agencies that recognized the potential significance of the research. The institute maintained the largest database of documented temporal anomalies in the world and provided resources for researchers, families, and individuals interested in understanding these phenomena. The institute had also become a center for developing new theoretical frameworks for understanding consciousness, time, and family relationships that could accommodate the evidence for temporal anomalies while maintaining scientific rigor and empirical validation. This work had attracted collaboration from physicists, neuroscientists, philosophers, and researchers from multiple disciplines who were interested in exploring the implications of temporal consciousness for their respective fields. As the research entered its second decade, Patricia reflected on how the simple mystery of James Blackwood's presence in the 1902 family portrait had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of human consciousness and the nature of reality itself. The work had challenged her own assumptions about the limitations of scientific knowledge and had opened new questions about the relationship between love, consciousness, and the structure of time. The Blackwood portrait remained the most thoroughly documented and frequently cited case in the research literature, serving as the foundational example that had established the credibility and significance of temporal anomaly research. Eleanor Blackwood had lived to see her family's mysterious photograph become the catalyst for a new field of scientific inquiry that had implications far beyond genealogy and family history. James Blackwood's appearance in the 1902 photograph had proven to be just the beginning of a story that continued to unfold across generations and continents, revealing the extraordinary capacity of human consciousness and family bonds to transcend the apparent limitations of time and space. The mystery that had begun in a Boston genealogist's office had become a global investigation into the deepest questions about human existence and the power of love to reshape reality itself. The research had demonstrated that some family stories were too profound to be contained within conventional understanding of chronology and causality. Instead, they required new frameworks for understanding consciousness and relationship that could accommodate the evidence for connections that transcended temporal boundaries and physical limitations. As Patricia continued her work at the Institute, she remained guided by the wonder and humility that had characterized her investigation from its beginning. The temporal anomalies in family photography had taught her that reality was far more mysterious and beautiful than conventional science had imagined, and that the bonds between family members might indeed be the most powerful forces in the universe, capable of creating connections that endured across any distance of time or space. The 1902 Blackwood portrait continued to hang in Eleanor's home, but it had also been reproduced in research publications, museum exhibitions, and educational materials around the world. It had become an icon representing the possibility that love and family connection could overcome any obstacle, including the fundamental barriers that seemed to separate past, present, and future. And sometimes, when researchers studying the portrait looked at it during quiet moments in their laboratories and offices, they reported seeing subtle changes in the expressions of the family members, as if the temporal bridge that had allowed James to appear in the photograph continued to operate, allowing the Blackwood family to observe and respond to the ongoing investigation into their extraordinary legacy. The mystery had become more than a subject of scientific study. It had evolved into a source of hope and wonder that reminded everyone who encountered it that human consciousness and love possessed capabilities that exceeded the boundaries of conventional understanding, and that some family bonds were indeed strong enough to reshape the very fabric of reality itself.